So let me ask you a question. It sounds simple, but it's one of the trickiest questions in the world. Who's the ultimate boss? Today we're going to dig into the one concept that tries to answer that, a word that shapes pretty much everything from trade deals to actual wars, and that word is sovereignty. Think about it. Inside our own countries, things are usually pretty clear, right? You've got a government, you've got laws, police, there's a definite hierarchy. But what happens when you zoom out to the world stage? If two countries have a massive disagreement, who gets to make the final call? I mean, who is really in charge? And trying to figure that out, well, that is the fundamental puzzle of global politics. So, to get to the bottom of this, here's our game plan. We'll start with what sovereignty actually means. Then, we'll jump back in time to see where it came from. Spoiler alert, it was chaos. We'll look at how the idea clashes with reality, what new pressures are putting it to the test, and then we'll ask the big question, what's the future of supreme power?
Okay, first things first. Before we can talk about where this idea is going, we've got to be on the same page about what sovereignty actually is.
At its absolute core, sovereignty is all about ultimate authority. The word itself literally comes from the Latin for supreme power. You can think of it as the buck stops here principle for an entire country. But it's not just about what happens inside the country. It's also about how that country faces the rest of the world. It really operates in two key ways.
So, on one hand, you have internal sovereignty. That just means the government is the top dog inside its own borders. It's the highest authority, period. But then you've got external sovereignty, which means the state looks out at the world and says, there's no one above me. It doesn't answer to any other country or some kind of world government. And you really need both to be a truly sovereign state.
But why did we even come up with this idea of an ultimate boss? I mean, where did it come from? To get that, you have to imagine what the world was like before it, and frankly, it was a time of brutal, near-constant chaos.
Yeah, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes had this famously dark picture of life without a strong ruler. He called it the state of nature, which was basically a war of everyone against everyone. Life, in his iconic words, was just solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So sovereignty wasn't just some abstract political theory, it was seen as the only solution to that nightmare.
And you can literally watch this idea evolve over centuries. It gets started in the 1500s with guys like Jean Baudin, who used it to argue that the French king should have power over all the squabbling local lords. But the real game changer was 1648. The Peace of Westphalia ended these horrifying religious wars with a simple, revolutionary idea. What happens in your territory is your business, and nobody else gets a say. Just a few years later, Hobbes gave this idea its philosophical backbone in his book Leviathan. And then, fast forward another century, and the French Revolution comes along and completely flips the script, saying this supreme power doesn't belong to a king, it belongs to the nation, to the people themselves.
You know, the world map we see today, with all its neat borders, that wasn't a given. It was forged in the fire of incredibly destructive wars, like the 30 Years' War. This moment in history marked a huge shift away from a world where a religious authority like the Pope could call the shots, to a new world where kings, and eventually states, were the absolute masters of their own turf.
And building on that revolutionary energy, thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau took it one giant step further. They basically argued that a state's right to rule, its actual legitimacy, comes from the people it governs. It's this idea of a social contract, that we the people agree to give the government power in exchange for protection and order. And that idea right there is the bedrock of modern democracy.
So, that's the beautiful theory, right? A world of equal, independent states, all powered by the will of their people. It sounds great on paper, but the reality of how power actually works between nations is a whole lot messier and way more unequal.
The political theorist Kenneth Waltz explained this difference perfectly. He said, look, politics inside a country is a hierarchy. You have rulers and you have the ruled. But international politics, that's an anarchy. Now hold on. Anarchy doesn't have to mean chaos and violence. In this sense, it just means there is no world government. There's no global 911 to call. There is no one above the states to lay down the law.
And this is where things get really interesting, because we have to see sovereignty in two different ways. On the one hand, it's a legal status. It's kind of black and white. You're either a legally independent country or you're not. But on the other hand, sovereignty is a capacity. It's a whole bundle of powers. And this is not black and white at all. This is about a country's actual real-world ability to get things done.
And that capacity, that real-world power, is wildly different from country to country. I mean, technically, on paper, the Maldives and China are both sovereign states. They're equals. But in reality, as this quote points out, in terms of sheer strength and influence, they're not even in the same league. So while all states might be legally equal, in practice, some are definitely more sovereign than others.
But here's the thing. This old-school idea of the state as this untouchable, impenetrable fortress, well, it's starting to show some serious cracks. In our modern, interconnected world, the whole concept of absolute sovereignty is getting squeezed from all sides. So what's pushing back?
Well, this leads to what I think is a fascinating paradox. It turns out that to actually become more powerful and effective, to be more sovereign in a practical sense, states often have to agree to give up a little piece of their sovereignty. It sounds weird, but think about something as simple as sending a letter. For international mail to work, every country had to agree to the same rules through the Universal Postal Union. They gave up a tiny slice of independence, and in return, they gained this massive new ability to connect with the entire world.
And once you see this pattern, you see it everywhere. You have organizations like the UN that can authorize action against a country. You have international courts that claim they can put a nation's leaders on trial. The very idea of universal human rights says that how a state treats its own people is actually everybody's business. Then there's globalization, where economies are so tangled up that no nation is truly an island. And even from within, you have indigenous groups challenging the state's total authority.
A tragic, real-world example like the Syrian civil war just lays this whole conflict bare. On one side, you have the traditional, pluralist view. Syria is a sovereign country, period. Foreigners have no right to interfere. But then there's the solidarist view, which argues there's a higher duty, a global responsibility to protect human beings from atrocities, even if that means crossing a border and violating a state's sovereignty. And there are just no easy answers here.
So, with all these pressures, it all leads to this huge question about the future. Is this 400-year-old idea still the right tool for the job?
And what's really amazing is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself hints at a totally different kind of future. Article 28 says the goal isn't just to protect states. The goal is to build a world where individual people can actually flourish. It subtly shifts the focus away from the security of the state and toward the dignity of the human being.
So we're left with this massive question. In a world that's wrestling with problems that just don't care about our borders, I'm talking about pandemics, climate change, financial meltdowns, is the idea that every state is its own supreme boss still helpful? Or has clinging to that old idea of absolute sovereignty become a dangerous illusion, one that's actually stopping us from solving the biggest challenges we all share?